People are estranged from God and each other, and God's purpose, again, is to reconcile humankind both to himself, but also to each other. I'd encourage you to read Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 through 19, that talk about God's work of reconciling humankind to himself and to each other. We're made to be connected to others in fellowship and community. We don't have time to talk about all the features and characteristics of the church, but I do want to point out that it is a community where people are in covenant to care for one another. It's not optional. We, as Christians, when we are baptized and we say our baptismal vows, or when we join the church and recite the membership vows, we pledge covenantal vows to be in covenant not only with God, but with one another as a community. We are in a covenant to care for one another. Think about Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. This is one of my favorite passages in all the New Testament. It talks about what the early church's community life looked like. I'll just read it to you real quickly. This is Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. It says, it's describing life in the early church. It says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. You notice there, the appearance of the word fellowship. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship. That's verse 42. The Greek word for fellowship, you've probably heard it. It's a very famous word in the life of the church, and you've probably heard it in sermons. It's the word koinonia, and it means fellowship, but it's talking about a deep, intimate fellowship, a deep sharing in life, sharing possessions, but sharing time and relationship, intimacy. And that word actually appears twice in this passage. Verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship. And then down in verse 44, where it says, all who believed were together and had all things, the English translates it in common, but that word common is a form of koinonia. It renders a form of the word koinonia, so it appears twice. What was the early church life like? It was a life characterized by deep fellowship, deep sharing of life, living life together, being together. And throughout the New Testament, we read about how this fellowship was manifested in signs of love and affection in the early Christian community. I'll just give you a couple of examples of that, how this idea of deep sharing, love, affection was manifested in the early church. Even in the preaching and teaching of Jesus. One of the most repeated parables in the church is the parable of the prodigal son, right? Luke 15. And in that parable, the father is portrayed as one who, quote, embraced and kissed his returning son. All right. Now, the usual interpretation of the parable of the prodigal son is that the father's behavior symbolizes the behavior of God himself, right? It's God who watches the horizon for the return of the son. And when he sees the son coming down the path, the father rushes off the porch and rushes out, throws himself on him, hugging him and kissing him. Well, that's how God responds to the lost who return home, right? God is a God who embraces and kisses his people. If God were here in physical manifestation, he would be a God who would embrace you and kiss you. Many of the stories about Paul in the New Testament, they talk about, Paul's own advice for how the Christians were to behave in church. He encouraged early Christians to use signs of affection to convey that same kind of love the Father lavished on the prodigal son. He encouraged the early Christians to use those same kinds of sign of affection to convey love and affection to one another. He instructed them to greet one another with a holy kiss. And he actually repeats that a number of times. Romans 16:16, 1 Corinthians 16:20, 2 Corinthians 13:12, and 1 Thessalonians 5:26. Now, we're probably not going to implement kissing in church, but we have modern day equivalents of that. And those modern day equivalents are shaking hands, clasping hands, putting our arm around one another, hugging one another. All the expectation is that in church we would develop closeness and cultivate closeness and express that closeness to one another. There's another wonderful story in Acts chapter 20, verse 37. When Paul planted churches and went back to visit them, he would often stay with them for long periods of time. Some of the congregations he developed, he would stayed with them 1.5 to 2 years. And in one particular case in Acts 20, the text tells us how when it came time for him to leave, the members of his congregation were weeping, embracing, and kissing him as they bade him farewell. That's Acts 20, verse 37. There's a closeness there that's been developed and that's being expressed. Now, what I've told you this morning is simply that we in the church really do need each other. And those in the world outside the church need reconciliation and fellowship too. They may just not know it. Now, we are still in quarantine. Some components of our society are still in quarantine. The United Methodist churches are reopening very slowly. So most congregations in the Virginia Conference, or at least many of them, remain closed. So we have to respect people's fears. And if they don't want to hug or shake hands, we should certainly honor that. In certain circumstances, we should wear masks. But despite all these kinds of precautions, God's people still must work to rebuild a sense of community in our society. I think over these last few months, not just due to the quarantine, but also due to various expressions of civil unrest, rioting, and so on, there's been a lot of fracturing that's occurred in our society, and God's people are called to work towards rebuilding a sense of community in our society. How are we going to do that in a time of quarantine? Well, we can send letters or emails to folks. If you have an iPhone, or you could even do it with an Android, you can send texts. I often do this various times of the day. I'll send, somebody will be on my mind. I'll send them a text. How you doing? Hey, I was just thinking about you. For those of you who are close to me, you know that sometimes I do that between 1 and 2 a.m. and people are not always happy to get those texts if they keep their notifications on. But you can call people, visit with them on the phone. If people are comfortable, we can take walks outside with them, just walk a few feet apart. We can meet friends at the coffee shop, and if we can sit a few feet apart. If they feel safer, we can sit out on the porch. We have to reach out to those who have become isolated and model what it looks like to be in community, in relationship. We have to take the initiative during this time of quarantine to work toward restoring community. And that's my message to you this morning, that God's people have to work to rebuild a sense of community in our society. The world needs reconciliation and fellowship. They needed it before COVID-19, and now they need it more than ever. God bless you.